We're very happy to welcome a wonderful gentleman who's going to speak to us about the work of evangelization in the parish. And in order to make known to you who don't know much about him, and some of you do, I'd like to introduce Nancy Pineda Madrid, who is on the theology faculty here at Boston College and at the Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry. So Nancy, please.
Alan, bienvenido. Es un honor y un privilegio para tenerte aquí con nosotros. It's a wonderful honor and a great, great privilege to have Alan here in our midst. A few words about his background, and then I want to give you just a little more of a personal introduction to Alan. I've known Alan for, I think, over close to 20 years. We met in the late 1980s. So it's wonderful to have him here because I've seen his work progress over many, many years. He has a PhD in Spanish and Latin American Studies from St. Louis University. He has a doctorate in Sacred Theology from the Greg in Rome, a Master's of Divinity from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, a degree in Pastoral Ministry from the Brazilian Development Institute in Rio de Janeiro. And he has won as well. He has many, many publications. If you're a regular reader of America, you would know Alan's work. And also he's published in Theological Studies and many other journals, theological journals. He is a practical theologian of the highest order among Catholic theologians in the United States today, and one of his earliest works is The Second Wave, which won an award and was one of my first introductions to U.S. Latino theology. He is a member of the California Province of Jesuits, and he's done a great number of things in his life, and I just want to say a bit of my knowledge of him and his contribution to our church. There are 3 points I just want to make about him. He's a man of great vision. He's a man of great imagination. He's a man who's pragmatic, political, and on the ground in terms of his know-how and his ability to get things done. He's a visionary in that he has the ability to see what the church needs well into the future, and he is someone who, to use a phrase that's near and dear to my heart, he's like a midwife. But it may be an odd kind of a thing, but he sees what is coming, and he helps that to come to be, to come to birth. He has done that in his work in Actus. He was one of the founders of Actus, which is the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, was founded in 1988. He was its first president, and he really mentored it very much into being. It now has close to 200 members and is in its 20th year, and it's one of the 4th or 5th largest theological academies in the world. So it's quite significant in terms of its development in a very short 20 years. He also inaugurated the National Catholic Conference of Hispanic Ministries, which is an umbrella organization of all kinds of Hispanic ministry organizations across the country, in the fields of theology, catechetics, youth ministry, young adult ministry, and every other kind of ministry you might imagine, where there's a national organization that responds to the needs of Hispanic Catholics in the United States. Alan pulled the leadership of all of these various organizations into an umbrella. He was its first president, executive director. He saw that into being. Another example of a birth that he was instrumental in having happen, and now it is very strong and active to this day. So he gives birth to these various institutions, and then they get launched and they move along. And then following that, in 1997, he instituted the Loyola Institute for Spirituality in Orange County, California. And he was also the director of that institute for its first 10 years. And he, in his wisdom, realized that the spiritual exercises really need to become available to all kinds of people. So the Loyola Institute made available the spiritual exercises in Spanish, in Vietnamese, and in many other languages in Southern California, and available to lay people. So a new vision of what the spiritual exercises could be for lay people. And now, very recently, thankfully, the bishops of the United States knocked on his door, and he is been recently appointed the very first president and executive director of the Office for Cultural Diversity in the Church, which is an umbrella organization that responds to Hispanic Latino Catholics, African American Catholics, Asian and Pacific Island Catholics, Native Americans, African Catholics, and the office that was formerly, is still titled Pastoral Care to Migrants and Refugees and Travelers. So it's an umbrella office of the bishops that responds to the needs of all these various groups. And I don't think the bishops in this country could have found a more appropriate person and a more promising individual to bring to life this new office for the bishops. So I am just delighted to have known Alan for these 20 years and to have been a witness to his prophetic and just amazing ministry and work. And I would ask that you join me in welcoming Alan here to Boston College.
Thank you very much, Nancy. My mother would have been delighted at that introduction. It was great. Thanks. This evening, I want to share with you 6 different areas, six different parts to my conversation with you this evening. And I just want to lay them out there so that you have a sense of where I hope we're going to go. See if we actually get there. But first, I just want to have a little introduction to put my presence here with you this evening in context a little bit. Second part, I'm going to focus on the key point here, the notion of evangelization, how it's understood, and why I think it's so important. I'm going to talk about, the third part is why I believe that this notion, which is so central to understanding what we're about in the church, has not been received very well in the church, particularly in the United States. And that's an issue, that's an important issue, I believe. I'm going to try to characterize a bit the situation that we find ourselves in the church today, particularly vis-a-vis the parish reality and pastoral realities, and some of the factors that contribute to the need that I see that's implicit and I think explicit in what I'm going to say, the need that we have to move on, in thinking through and imagining what it is that we're doing in the parish ministry. The fifth part of my presentation has to do with a key neuralgic point, ministry, and how we understand the connection, the correspondence between ministry, the structures of ministry in the church, and the church's identity as evangelizer. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about that, some key issues that I think are important there. And finally, something that may be particularly useful or practical at this point in time, talking about the reality of diversity in the American Catholic Church, the growing presence of so many different cultures, and the transformation that has taken place in the American Catholic Church in our lifetime, making it a church primarily of people of non-European background, which is what it has become in our time. So those are the 6 areas that I want to develop this evening, and I don't know whether time will really allow us to do it, but we'll try, because I would like I would like to have some time to converse with you all and to get some feedback this evening, so I'll try to be snappy, okay? The first thing, it's an honor to be here at Boston College. You know, I don't know, this is exaggerating, and maybe this is what Father Leahy likes to put on brochures, but in a lot of ways this institution is a flagship of Catholic education and Catholic higher education, Jesuit education in the United States, and it is an honor to be here because I know that the role that it plays in the church and in the country. My remarks this evening are not those of the bishops that I work for. They're my own ideas. I think that this moment is important, and it's great that we're here on the eve of the visit of Pope Benedict, because I think that the coming of Pope Benedict is an opportunity for us to kind of take a look at the United States on the occasion of his visit, the visible head of the church being here with us, and undoubtedly the press and a lot of people are going to be focusing on our reality, and it's good to be able to reflect on it in the context of the attention that I think the church will be getting next week when Pope Benedict is here. I have somewhat of an uneasy feeling in speaking to you the way I'm going to speak this evening about evangelization, and it has to do with this. It seems to me that the church here in Boston, and I don't know a lot about it, but I do read the newspapers, has experienced a kind of trauma. And because you are in some stage of trauma, given what happened over the past several years, I think it may be a little bit difficult to get into the spirit of what I'm going to be talking about, because what I'm talking about is really very prospective. And it also may have what appears to have an element of a Pollyannishness about it, because I'm talking about a vision, fundamentally a vision of church. But it's very hard to focus on something as upbeat and optimistic as what I'm hoping to share with you, this vision that I have coming out of the church's teaching on evangelization, in the context of a church, a local church like this one, that's hurting. I think it's hurting. People tell me that it's hurting. And so I apologize for that, because maybe we should be talking about that. I don't know. I'm sure you've had opportunities to talk about it, but I do want to be sensitive to that and let you know that I understand that people are in the reality that they are in. And sometimes it's a little bit harder to look beyond it, because we're still hurting. So my remarks here really have to do with looking beyond. No doubt about that. Okay. So I want to talk about evangelization. When I talk about evangelization, I'm using that word in the way that it's understood in the church's teaching, particularly in Gaudium et Spes, which in Vatican II is that moment when that concept began to really take hold of the church, and then as it was raised up in a very stimulating and way that had its impact on many areas in the church throughout the world, in Evangelii Nuntiandi by Pope Paul VI, picked up by John Paul II, and made one of the principal currents in the way that John Paul spoke about the church, and in which the church itself at different moments, whether it be in synods or in meetings of bishops that took place either in the United States or in Latin America, or synods that took place in other parts of the world, that provided a language, yes, a rhetoric, for talking about what the church's identity is, and that was taken up finally in documents that are very historic, the coming together of the North American Church and the South American or Latin American Church at the Synod of the Americas, and was enshrined in Ecclesia in America, that document that tried to project a vision of what the churches are about in North America and South America. And then finally, in the recent meeting that you may have heard of the bishops in Latin America, in Aparecida in Brazil, where once again they went back to this concept and formulated the vision that they have for the Church of Latin America in relationship to the North American Church, precisely in terms of evangelization. So, in other words, this is the way the church in our time is talking about itself, and it is promoting this understanding of itself as a way forward, a way to move into the future, a way to understand what we are about. Someone said and I'm not sure exactly who it was. I first heard it from our colleague Juan Lorenzo Hinojosa, a Latino theologian. He said that when you get into the concept of evangelization, the way it's developed in the church's documents, it becomes, helpful to think of it in terms of this phrase: the mission has a church. The mission has a church. In other words, the concept of mission is really at the heart, is the inspiration that we have that helps us understand what we are about and what we're doing and where we're going. And I think that generally the Church in the United States is not characterized by a very profound or deep sense of mission, okay? And that's why, for me, it's very important to keep coming back to this idea of evangelization in order to get back on track. The way the church understands evangelization is nuanced and rich. And usually that does not come across, because the word has tended to be used in our country almost exclusively to mean outreach. But in the church's document, it just isn't outreach. It really has three legs upon which it stands. And that's what makes evangelization a way of looking at what we are about, an affirmation of the church's identity that provides a framework, what I would call a framework for understanding everything that we are about. And I believe it's a framework that could help us transcend or go beyond some of the tremendous barriers and difficulties, or even divisions, that we've experienced in the church since the Second Vatican Council, if we really take the concept to heart, because the concept is quite inclusive. The concept is very rich, and I think that there's a way in which many of the values that people have fought for in the period after Vatican II, there are many ways in which they can find in the church's teaching on evangelization all kinds of encouragement, all kinds of help. What are those three legs? The first one is when the church talks about its identity in terms of evangelization, it's speaking about the need to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and to offer the opportunity to people to have a personal encounter with God in Jesus Christ. So a first and fundamental moment in the processes of evangelization is the proclamation of the good news and the encounter with the person of Jesus Christ. The second leg of that is liberation. That is, embodying the relationship that we have with Christ in Christ's love and in following of Christ, which takes us directly into the area of justice and transformation of the social order, the economic order, and culture. This is the whole area of faith and justice. And the third leg upon which evangelization rests is ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. That this is not something that we can pick and choose, that it is absolutely fundamental to what it is that we are about as Christians, and there's no way that we can let go of the requirement, of the demand that we have that received from Christ to seek for unity among all believers and among Christians, but also to seek for understanding with all people of goodwill of whatever religion. Those, in a very quick way, I told you I was going to be snappy, those are the three legs upon which the church's understanding of evangelization stand. Now, behind that, but really very fundamental to it, is the idea that the target and the outcome of the church's pursuit of its identity in the world, the target and the outcome of what the church tries to do is always culture, so that it is impossible for the church to pursue its identity, to be faithful to its mission, if the church is not an expert in the area of culture. And by culture, I mean in the anthropological meaning of culture, the way it started to be used, at least in the Catholic Church, in Gaudium et Spes, number 56 and following, in that document, the anthropological concept that fundamentally sees culture as revolving around symbol, narrative, and ritual. And so when we evangelize, when we proclaim the gospel, when we go about the transformation of the human heart, the transformation of the social order, the change in the world that we hope to accomplish, the object of all of that is fundamentally culture, because culture is that place where people are who they are. It is how they are, who they are. And so the encounter with the gospel means some kind of change that's going to take place. This idea about the central place of culture has been very problematical, maybe more problematical in the United States than in some other places, because the United States somehow or other tended and tends to view itself as somehow maybe above culture or beyond culture. This nation came into existence as the result of a process of forgetting the old culture and forging a new one. And so when people come here, very often the impression is given that all you need to do is give up your culture in order to become this new reality, but which itself is a culture, of course. And so we tend to be somewhat oblivious, more oblivious than usual, to the reality of culture. And therefore, it makes it hard for us to really get at that level of that we need to be at in order to understand how evangelization really works. John Paul II added a notion to this discussion of evangelization that I think is very important, very telling, and I don't know that it's gotten the attention that it deserves. He spoke of the new evangelization. And by the new evangelization, he meant proclaiming the gospel, yes, so it's evangelization, but with a new ardor, with new expressions, and with new methods. I think that was very interesting because some people, would view John Paul as somewhat of a conservative pope that had an agenda that had to do with perhaps bringing forward some of the traditions of the past and so forth. But on the other hand, in his message about the new evangelization, he was giving us permission to experiment. He was giving us permission to try something new, to do something different, so that I don't know how serious we took this. But for me, this is very important because he is pointing out the fact that the communication of the faith that characterized the 20th century, the Catholic Church in the 20th century, and maybe even to the 21st century, the approach to the communication of the faith, for whatever reason, tended to be more intellectualizing and rational. And there are all kinds of reasons why we know that was the case. We were in dialogue with modernity and dialogue with the Enlightenment, and these were ways in which the church responded to the reality of its time and sought to be part of a dialogue. In the 20th and the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, though, there are reasons to think that the intellectualizing approach and the rationalizing approach to the faith that has been characteristic of the way we do things, and it's particularly true in a country like the United States, leader in modernity and now post-modernity, that we would proceed in that way. But it seems to me that what is being asked for when we refer to evangelization is an approach to communicating the faith that gives growing importance to affectivity, to emotion, to feeling. And that is one of the characteristics of the task that we have in this process that I think is going to take us a while to deal with. One of the reasons that evangelical Christianity and Pentecostalism have been very successful. Indeed, one could argue among the most successful movements in Christianity in our lifetime. One could argue about that, but I think one could defend that position, is precisely the importance and the role that affect, that emotion, that feeling is given in the communication of the faith in that form of Christianity, particularly in Pentecostalism, of course. And I believe that there is need, following on what the church means by evangelization, to look at how we go about doing what we do in a way that reflects more a respect for the affective aspect of how faith takes root and how it grows and how it develops. Those of us who work in the area of Latino theology have a sense of this, because one of the gifts that the Latinos bring to Christianity, obviously, is a strong sense of how affectivity plays out in the living of the faith. And that Hispanic Catholicism, or Iberian Catholicism, Iberian American Catholicism, is really a very brilliant example of how at one time the evangelization of people took root in a very rich and vibrant and graphic cultural form, which are the cultural forms and the religious forms, the popular religious forms that the Latin American people have developed over the centuries, that is very much part of their faith even today, even though, of course, it's in transformation and is changing, and it will continue to change. Recovering a respect and a sense of how affectivity fits into how we go about communicating the faith, I think, is very important. Walter Burkhardt, among others, who looked at the reality of how we preach in this country, pointed out the need for preaching that is much more affective, that has more fire to it. And I think that he was getting at this point. And those of us, once again, who have worked with Hispanos have had the experience more than once of the little old lady coming out of Mass, coming up to you and sheepishly saying, after she heard the Father's homily, asking, and not with any malice at all, does Father really believe in God? Because he didn't talk as if he did, you see. It didn't come across with that feeling, that emotion that would lead you to think that perhaps he did. That's one of the areas that's very important, trying to respond to the whole human being, to the whole person in the way we go about communicating the faith. And understanding who it is that we're preaching to, who it is that we're teaching, who it is that we're working with, of course. And it won't work with everybody, especially a group of Jesuits. But if you're too effective, if you're too emotive, huh? This is stuff probably that I'm sure that you've heard this before, but I just wanted to get you into some of the nuances in our understanding of evangelization, to give you a sense of how rich and interesting and inclusive, and how it could provide a very interesting framework for understanding what it is that we're about as followers of Christ and as teachers in the church. Why has this teaching on evangelization not been received? Okay, and that's my point. I have a couple of articles that I've written on the subject of why it hasn't been received, and I think it's kind of interesting to look at why it hasn't been received. One of the first reasons is that there's a generational problem. My generation of people don't like the word evangelization. We never used it, and even now we don't use it. Because my generation of Catholics, who were Vatican II Catholics, or even slightly pre-Vatican II Catholics, we identified evangelization with proselytism, and we don't do that. And of course, the church today doesn't mean proselytism when it uses the word evangelization, but that's what Protestants did, and we just don't go there. So there's just kind of an innate kind of gut level reaction. We don't particularly like that term. The other reason is that the interpretation of Vatican II, and I kind of follow Joseph Kamanchak in this idea. The interpretation of Vatican II that has tended to prevail, at least in the United States, gave a great deal of importance to the insistence of the Council on dialogue. And for many of us, really, that's what Vatican II was about. It was dialogue on many different levels. And therefore, it implied the need for us to be silent in the face of the encounter with people, with the modern world, first of all, but also with Christians of other denominations and with people of other religions. And we really got into it. And this was a very important value of Vatican II, which of course it is. But there was another side to Vatican II, and I think there were two wings upon which Vatican II flew. And the other wing, according to Kamanchak and I think others, was proclamation, because the Vatican Council did teach the importance of evangelization. And evangelization isn't only about dialogue, it certainly is about that, but it's also about proclamation, which means asserting in some way what it is that we believe, what it is that is of value to us, what it is that our faith teaches us. Joseph Ratzinger uses the term positivism of faith, the positivism of faith. I think that's kind of an interesting way of putting it. Others perhaps would call it orthodoxy, but I think it's more than orthodoxy. I mean, it's being upfront regarding the bottom line about what it is, why it is that we're Christians and what it is that we're about as Christians, and not being afraid to share that with others, thinking that perhaps others would take offense if we were to tell them about what it is that we believe. But there was a whole problem, I think, in my generation, and maybe even now, there's a whole difficulty of putting together those two pieces, the dialogical part and the proclaiming part of what we do. The other thing that occurred, of course, is that these differences of interpretation got pretty well subsumed into a liberal conservative kind of polarization situation that took different forms. One of them was, a conservative response that ended up being perhaps apologetic, neo-apologetic, that had the virtue of trying to assert with some clarity teachings, basic teachings of the faith, the concern and the excitement around, at least in some quarters, around the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that kind of thing. And then the response on the part of other people of a more liberal persuasion, who viewed those things really as proposing something that really didn't seem very likely or very possible. That is, going back to something, as if, if one was doing that, you were proposing that we were going to go back and restore something, when most of us know that in the modern world, it's not a question of moving back at all. We're always moving forward one way or the other. And so we have to figure out how to bring the tradition along with us, not to go back to something. And so it didn't seem, the conservative responses seemed not particularly on target. And then there was a lot of back and forth, and many issues that have characterized the debates between liberals and conservatives had to do with issues that arise in the context of the faith's encounter with modernity and how we are going to respond to it and how to do that. One example, in my opinion, I don't know how you feel about it, of how the church's teaching on evangelization maybe got a little bit off center, maybe got somewhat distracted, revolves around that second leg that I shared with you, the commitment to social justice. It seems that at this point in history, people who are reflecting about the commitment to faith that does justice are realizing that sometimes the orientation toward faith doing justice by people that were very enthusiastic about that idea, which is fundamental to evangelization, that idea was expressed more as the result of an ethical, moral reflection than it was as a response to the encounter with Christ that flowed from a commitment to truly follow Christ. In other words, the spirituality in the justice piece was left out, and in its place there was a rational, ethical, moral understanding that frequently ended up using the categories of a prevailing ideology, not that ideologies per se are bad, but that it was coming more out of a progressive ideology or a socialist ideology or some ideology or other, rather than being grounded more explicitly in faith and grounded more explicitly in the following of Christ. And I think that much work still needs to be done. Maybe Pope Benedict's concept of social charity, the way he develops it in his first encyclical, might be perhaps one of the ways to keep pursuing this, the importance of linking the faith commitment more explicitly to the encounter with Christ than has been the case up to now. Anyway, I think that one of the results of when you look at the Catholic Church in the last 20, 30 years in the United States is that for various reasons we simply didn't want to go seriously into the idea of evangelization and affirm all three aspects of it that people were picking and choosing, and there was not an overall framework that was moving us forward in what we were about and the vision that we had of things in the church. Today we find ourselves in a situation that is characterized by what perhaps some people would call a certain malaise. The malaise in the Catholic Church in the United States is something that certainly antedates, in my view, whatever difficulties we had over the sexual abuse issue, although certainly that didn't help. The malaise, I think, had something to do with the fact that the Catholic Church had reached a certain term, a certain point in its development in the country. It had reached the end of the line of the process of receiving and working with the European immigrant groups. It had built up many of its institutions like this one where we are this evening, and many other great institutions, and that in a certain sense, it was kind of limited by brick and mortar. It was limited by a lot of territory, even wealth, that it had developed and obtained over a century and a half as part of a fabulous cycle in its history. And that one of the characteristics of the institutions then that we have has tended to be a desire to maintain themselves, which is characteristic of institutions. But I want to focus now, not so much, I don't want to talk about universities, I want to talk about parishes, parishes as institutions that instead of seeing themselves as being committed to the church's identity, which is to evangelize, as I described it a minute ago, see themselves more as communities that exist in order to, bring people together and to worship and to celebrate the Eucharist and to do what parishes do and to do it well, and not necessarily seeing themselves as focused a great deal on outreach or anything like that. Certainly some do, but that by and large it's a more serene, a more sedate kind of vision of what is involved in parish. Now, this idea is not unique to me. Avery Dulles in 1992 wrote an article in America in which he talked about the evangelizing parish, and he came to the conclusion that they weren't very evangelizing, okay? And that too is my conclusion, that they're not very evangelizing, that they do a lot of good things, but that evangelization is not one of the strong points, as at least the way we understand it in the church's documents here. So we were taken up with the need of maintaining the institution that frequently, was structured in a territorial way. Certainly they were very successful. The American parish was really, in the Universal Church, perhaps the most successful form of parish in the history of the church, developed here in the United States. There's no question about that, and that there's a great deal of great things that go on in the 19,000 or more parishes that we have in the United States. The problem, though, is that we have a vision of church that in the parish that frequently seems to turn what is an instrument into an end. In other words, that we're just about maintaining the parish, and that's the end of it. And we don't see the parish as existing for something beyond itself. And what it exists for is to really reach out and to really pursue those three legs of the church's vision of its identity in evangelization. It tends to be wrapped up in certain functions and frequently is unable for various reasons to get to the deeper aspects of the evangelizing process. Today there's something happening that is helping us understand alternatives to the parish. That there really are alternatives to the parish, which sounds almost heretical when you put it so directly, huh? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll give you an example. The movements represent in our time an interesting phenomenon by which the message is being communicated, by which people are being convened, that is motivating people to gather into community, that offers them a context even in which they celebrate the Eucharist with regularity, and is providing a focus for leadership, usually, interestingly enough, of lay people, not so much of the clerics. And the examples would be many that you're familiar with, communion and liberation, the charismatic renewal, marriage encounter, the focolare, another example historically in the 20th century, of course, the Opus Dei, and it goes on and on. There are many examples of this. Because in Rome, they're, I think, very sensitive to this teaching on evangelization. Rome, for several years now, has been showing a certain amount of interest in the movements by, for instance, convening the worldwide movements together. They've done it already twice in Rome, and they did it once in Latin America, pointing out, the important role that movements have. This was brought to my attention a few years ago at the time of Pope John Paul II's last visit to Spain. In his last visit to Spain, they did a survey and they discovered that 45% of all the Spaniards relate to the church not through a parish, but through a movement. Now, in the United States, that would be very rare because movements have never been that significant. And yet, they could become significant, huh? And it represents another possibility. But and I have an article in America that came out a couple of years ago on this subject. Usually the parish priests don't relate with a lot of encouragement to the movements. That's been my experience, and I think that's pretty much the case. Some do, but most don't, because it's hard to figure out how the movement is going to contribute to the parish sometimes, although not necessarily, but sometimes that's the case, or maybe often that's the case. And so they tend to not go there. And yet, when you look around and you ask, where is there vitality in the church today, I think it's pretty clear that there's something going on with these movements. And that's a whole area of outreach, of evangelization, that I think we need to look at. Now, why are we not into this more? Why are we a little bit, in my view, stuck with this more maintenance model of parish? Why are we more reluctant to reach out? I think that there are different reasons why, and I want to go then to this neuralgic point, which is ministry, okay? The neuralgic point. To put it very clearly, I would express it this way. The church right now doesn't have a ministerial structure that corresponds to what it teaches about evangelization. Because if it really was going to be consistent with pursuing its identity in the manner in which Evangelii Nuntiandi and these other documents of the church express it, the way they express it, then it would have to have many, many more people engaged in promoting the church's outreach. In other words, it would have to go beyond, much more beyond the number of clerics, the number of religious, the number of lay ecclesial ministers that it has currently engaged in ministry. And so there's a certain disconnect, in my opinion, between the church's teaching and then what we have practically at the ministerial level, at the existence of the church. And this is an ongoing sore point, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, it seems. But therefore, we need to look then at some critical points. One would be the reality of the formation of priests and seminarians, and deacons. So I'll start there. A problem that I think that we have is that, and I've worked with diocesan priests a lot in my life, and know many. I myself have been a pastor of a parish, and it seems to me that the way the priests think about themselves does not reflect the church's teaching of evangelization. I mean, the way that priests think about themselves is more in terms of an imagination of fairly clearly defined roles that they have known since the time they grew up, you know, in the life of a priest, that revolve around a certain vision, let's say, of parish ministry, especially if one's going to be a diocesan priest. And that's pretty much what it is. And it's kind of, that's what priests do. So there isn't a great deal of, and I know that part of it, it's not just the priests, but also perhaps the bishops also think that way. But what I want to raise up is what I believe to be is a lack of correspondence between a narrow, that narrow a vision of what the priest is about, because it really doesn't correspond to what the church is saying needs to happen. So we need to break through. Now, why don't we break through? There are all kinds of reasons. One of them probably would be a basic one. We're not sure how we could ever support priests that did something else in some other way, even economically. That'd be an issue. We'd have to look into how that would be. Or, and it's not just that the priests are hung up on it, the faithful, you know, the people that are in those parishes, they have expectations of those parishes, how they want them to be. They don't necessarily want them to be reaching out, right? You know what happens in parishes. So there are a lot of issues, but certainly our imaginations have to be stimulated so that we can go beyond this more narrow sense of priesthood. It's true that the religious orders have historically tended to be places where the priests that come forward from them have tended to have, you know, a vision of their priesthood that's more missionary involved. But then it usually was foreign missions, you know, that concept of mission, but not the concept of mission that Evangelii Nuntiandi and these other teachings of the church are trying to put forward. And so the religious also have been sucked somewhat into the business of maintaining the system, you see. But it's not that the system it needs to be destroyed. That's not what I'm saying. But something else has to arise from it if we're going to be consistent with what the church is telling us about evangelization. So there has to be an explosion of imagination around that. Something that isn't helping us right now is that, and there's a lot of complaints about this, I hear them all the time actually, that there are some young people entering seminaries who have perhaps even a more circumscribed idea of their priesthood than priests of other generations may have had. In other words, as they put it, we don't wash windows. The vision that some, and because I don't want to condemn all our young seminarians, but apparently there are some who seem to be fascinated by a certain characterization of the priesthood, you know, in terms of what the priest wears and where he lives and what he does, that really is out of character with the church's teaching about evangelization. Because if you're really into evangelization, you're going to be reaching out, you're going to be going to where the people are, not insisting that they come to where you are, and a lot of other things like that, that would kind of go contrary to this more circumscribed understanding of priesthood that some people have. So we really need to look at that. We really need to look at it because it really is inconsistent with the church's teaching. Now, a positive story, a positive development, is the permanent diaconate. Over the past 20 years, we've seen the 16,000 now men come forward to be ordained permanent deacons. Their wives, most of their wives, also trained along with them in many aspects of diaconia, of their ministry, who are assuming roles of leadership more and more all the time in the church in all kinds of ways, particularly in the area of service, the presence of the church in the prison, in the hospital, in works of social concern and so forth, which is a very, very good development and something that probably is not given the recognition that it deserves. We've got to do something with lay ecclesial ministries. We know that there's been an explosion of them, but we also know that there are serious problems that make the evangelizing mission less likely. We're not going to have the number of lay ministers that we need. They're going to get discouraged if we don't find ways in order to open up parish structures and other opportunities to serve the church for the growing numbers of laity who are coming forth. That is a complaint that is heard all over the country. People sacrifice, they study, sometimes they get credentials, they get degrees, and so forth, but there isn't always a place for them in the church. Because once again, we don't have a vision that's sufficiently broad, a vision of ministry that's sufficiently broad that configures the different duties in such a way that we can use and put this very talented laity to effective use. It's kind of like what the permanent deacons went through 30 years ago. Some of them are still going through it, I think. But it's a painful process, but we have to do something because the church is not going to accomplish its goal to evangelize this way. Religious men and women, there's no question but that something is happening now in the role that the religious play in the church, in the world. I would suggest that when you look at what's happening in the world and the thrust of evangelization, the transformation that is taking place with the religious has something to do with the religious reconfiguring how they serve the church, now in sync in some way, in unison in some way with the rise of the laity in partnership in ministry in the church. So the religious have to find ways to forge effective partnerships with laity. I know that with the Jesuits this has been a matter of great concern and we're continuing to do it, but it's not as easy as it sounds, and there are some pitfalls to this. But if we're really going to have a church that evangelizes and that has the foot soldiers that it needs in order to accomplish its purposes, its ends, then we're going to have to open up our understanding of ministry more than what it is right now and invite the lay people in, without, of course, distracting from the fact that the fundamental call of the laity is not ad intra, but is ad extra. That is, that in the spirit of Vatican II, the baptismal call of the laity has everything to do with the transformation of the world of work, the world of politics, the world of economics, the world of culture. In other words, we don't want to create a situation where the laity think that they're supposed to spend all their life or working for the church or in the church, when what we really want them to do is to be leaven in the world, for the transformation of the world. So keeping that balance is going to be a delicate thing, and I think it's a part of our difficulty. Finally, the challenge of diversity here and now. I like the framework that Lamin Sanneh has when he talks about the homeland church and the frontier church. The church in our time has become global. Just as in the United States, the church has become more third world than of European origin in our country, in the United States. Well, similarly, the global church, it has roots in the West, obviously, but it is really now a global church in which the majority of people, the majority of leadership in that church is African, is Asian, is Latin American. And diversity then in the context of globalization is here to stay, that indeed one might consider it a way in which the Catholicity of the church is coming to term, coming to flower in a way that it has never in the history of the church been able to develop. That universality of the message, the mutuality that exists between the message of Christ and people in their cultures, and that encounter between that gospel message and the encounter of cultures, interculturality, and all that that means, is really part of one of the great signs of our times. And the church here in the United States is seeing that more and more, and is going to have to come to terms with it. It's not just a question, as some people would say, of helping, for instance, helping immigrants assimilate, or helping people just to get by. Actually, what's at stake is a historical moment in which perhaps the Catholic Church, more than ever in its history, has the opportunity to make an impact in the United States, because never before has there been such a significant and large group of Catholics coming into the country at a time when there may be opportunity for intercultural encounter that would be more respectful of aspects of those Catholic cultures that those people bring, the blessings that those people bring, and how the blessings of the people that are coming into our country could affect the very tone and texture of Americans in the future, of American citizens of the future. Indeed, this was the idea that Cardinal Avery Dulles has brought up a couple of times in his talks, that he doesn't think that the Catholic Church has been that influential in American culture up to now. And I think there's a whole argument that one could make about that. But he says that the conditions may be coming about where that could change, huh? And that would be the result of the coming of the Hispanic people, the coming of other Catholic cultures, of Asia, for instance, the Filipino people, the Catholic people, and the African Catholics who are coming in now in significant numbers. It all depends on whether or not values that they bring will be nurtured and respected, and that will be able to make some impact on how it is that we are, quote unquote, American in years to come. And I think that's a historic opportunity that the Catholic Church has, and that's why it is invested so much in the concept of diversity. John Coleman, and I'm going to end just with something that I think is pretty practical regarding how to work with all of this diversity. John Coleman has noted 5 different principles that should be kept in mind in working with and receiving different people into parishes or any of the works that we are involved in with them. The first one is that merging cultural and language groups with a larger congregation too soon has a negative effect on the strength of their religious commitments. That's very important. In other words, there's always a certain anxiety in merging. You know, do we have a 2-track parish or a 3-track parish? The answer is yes, especially if the people I've just arrived here, they need to be nurtured. They need to be able to relate to the community from a position of strength. And when they're initially just beginning their engagement in a community, they're not going to feel strong. So we need to build up these communities. This is the historic pattern that the church used in other times. This is the historic pattern that it should use this time if it's going to be successful in truly integrating newcomers. So that's a good principle to keep in mind. Second principle, successful immigrant parishes are not only places of worship but also social centers where health, social, and material needs are also addressed, so that if we narrowly understand our parish as simply engaged in quote-unquote, nurturing the spirit, and we're not also dealing with the material reality of the people that are coming there, if they're immigrants or people of other cultures, we're really not going to create nearly as strong a community as we could. So we need to keep that in mind. 3, prayer and worship should normally not be multicultural or bilingual, because a people prefer to pray in their mother tongue. Yes. There are times when we're going to have to be bilingual and when it's appropriate to be bilingual. But to make bilingualism a policy, especially in the context of worship, doesn't seem to be a very good idea. Mainly because people want to pray in their own mother tongue. And if it's at all possible, we need to provide that opportunity for people. 4, if church space is used by diverse cultural groups, the issue of how to arrange and adorn the space is critical. Does that ring a bell? Okay, well, it's almost common sense, but sometimes we lose track of this. 5, leadership training is a sine qua non for effective pastoral ministries for the Hispanic community and many other communities that are arising in the church. A multicultural context often prescinds from this urgent need because there are other qualified non-Hispanic leaders available. In other words, we need to work with the community in such a way that we acknowledge their leadership and give their leadership an opportunity to come forward, even if sacrifice, yes, is going to be involved. It may be difficult. And the tendency to be creating multicultural offices in some places, not in every place, but in some places can be really destructive of the need that each group has to have its own leadership in order to thrive and to begin to step forward and develop itself. Okay, I've gone on way too long. I've said, I don't know, some things that I don't know whether it interests you or whether it's captured your fancy or maybe you disagree, but that's fine. This is the moment when we can, I hope, have a little give and take, huh? Thank you.